Dr. Elias Hart stepped off the silver shuttle and onto the surface of the alien world. The air smelled strange, like iron mixed with something sweet, and the sky was a pale green, streaked with two suns. Towering structures of metal and crystal stretched into the clouds, their surfaces reflecting light in sharp, dazzling patterns. Hart had studied alien worlds before, but this place felt different. It hummed with power, a quiet but overwhelming presence that seemed to watch him as he walked. He adjusted his bag over his shoulder and took a deep breath. This was not just any planet. This was the heart of the Zarek Empire, ruled by the most feared being in this part of the galaxy, Emperor Karvok. Legend said the Emperor had conquered dozens of planets with a mind sharper than any weapon and a heart colder than ice. Humans had always been a curiosity to him, small, fragile creatures who survived because of cleverness and stubbornness, not strength. And now one of those humans, Elias Hart, was here in his domain. The shuttle's doors slid shut behind him, and a group of Zarek attendants approached. They were tall, their skin a pale shade of violet, with long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly like embers. Hart felt their gazes like tiny flames on his skin. They spoke in clipped tones, their voices smooth but hard. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward and bowed slightly. "You are Dr. Elias Hart, human zoologist," the attendant said. His voice carried authority, though not the kind humans usually recognized. "The Emperor will see you shortly." Hart nodded, keeping his calm. He had met powerful leaders before, but something about this place made his stomach twist. It was not fear, it was curiosity mixed with caution. He had spent years studying creatures on strange worlds, watching their behavior, understanding their needs. And now he had a chance to study the creatures of this empire, and maybe, if he was careful, to teach the Emperor something about the power of care. The attendants led him through vast halls that sparkled like they were made of living crystal. Strange creatures moved in cages along the walls. Some were small, almost like birds, with wings that shimmered in colors Hart had never seen. Others were larger, with scales that glinted like polished stone, and eyes that seemed to hold knowledge. Hart's heart beat faster. The creatures looked intelligent, but he noticed the cages were too small, the spaces too barren. Many of them paced in circles or lay still, their eyes dull. "They are treated as treasures, not living beings," Hart whispered under his breath. The attendant did not answer. The hall opened into a massive chamber, and at the far end sat a figure on a throne that looked like it had been grown from crystal and steel. Emperor Karvok. The alien's body was taller than any human Hart had ever seen, with skin that shimmered like polished marble. His eyes were sharp and calculating, scanning Hart as though he were a puzzle to solve. A silence fell that made the walls hum. "You are human," the Emperor said finally. His voice was deep, smooth, and carried authority that made Hart straighten. "Why are you here?" Hart took a careful step forward. "I am here to study the creatures of your empire. To understand them. To record their behavior." He spoke calmly, but he could feel the weight of the Emperor's gaze. "And perhaps, to show that there is value in caring for them, not just keeping them." The Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Caring is weakness. Creatures exist to be used. Humans exist to survive. Do you think your empathy will change that?" Hart swallowed. He had expected skepticism, even mockery. "I think understanding their needs, their feelings, can teach much more than fear or force. And humans are proof of that. We survive because we feel, because we care, because we connect." The Emperor tilted his head, studying him like one of the creatures in the cages. Hart could feel the challenge in the silence, like a weight pressing on his chest. But he did not step back. He had faced danger before, on alien worlds, in storms, in jungles where creatures could tear a man apart. He knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. "Very well," the Emperor said at last, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You may study the creatures. But remember, human, my patience is short and my judgment is swift. Fail and you will learn what empathy is, too late." Hart nodded, hiding a shiver that was not entirely from fear. He was inside the heart of the Empire now. Every step he took among these strange creatures, every observation, every gentle touch would be watched. And he knew the Emperor's eyes would weigh every choice he made. As he was led toward the cages, Hart's mind raced. He did not just want to survive here, he wanted to teach, to show that even in a world ruled by strength and logic, empathy had power. He knelt beside a small, injured creature with glowing eyes and felt the familiar stir of connection. The Emperor watched silently from his throne, and for the first time Hart wondered, could a human really teach an emperor the meaning of care? The journey had begun, and already the creatures of the Zarek Empire were about to meet someone who would see them differently. Dr. Hart walked carefully among the cages, his eyes scanning every creature. Some were small and delicate, with skin like silk and wings that shimmered under the pale green light. Others were massive, with muscles coiled beneath tough scales, eyes glowing faintly as they studied him with quiet intelligence. He could see the fear in many of them, and it made his chest tighten. These creatures were not toys or trophies. They were alive, aware, and suffering because no one had cared enough to understand them. One creature caught his attention immediately. It was large, its body hunched and wounded, with patches of dark scales missing and a leg bent at an awkward angle. Its eyes were golden, wide with pain and distrust. The attendants had left it in a corner, muttering that it was worthless, a burden even for the Emperor's menagerie. Hart knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Easy," he whispered softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The creature hissed, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the hall, but it did not move away. Hart noticed the tension in its muscles, the way its tail twitched in fear. He understood animals, even alien ones, could feel fear, pain, and sometimes even loneliness. This one had clearly been ignored for a long time. He pulled a small kit from his bag: bandages, nutrient gels, and tools for care. Moving gently, he cleaned the wounded patches, murmuring reassurance. The creature flinched but did not attack. Hart worked slowly, making sure every movement was calm and deliberate. Hours passed, though Hart barely noticed. He was entirely focused on the creature's breathing, its reactions, the subtle signals it gave. Finally, the creature relaxed slightly, lowering its head toward him. Hart smiled quietly. "That's better. You're safe now." From the throne, Emperor Karvok watched silently. Hart could feel his piercing gaze even without looking up. He knew the Emperor saw everything, every careful motion, every second he spent tending to a creature the Emperor had written off as useless. "Why do you waste your time?" the Emperor's voice echoed, smooth and cold. "It will not serve you. It will not serve me. It is a weak, broken thing, and yet you care." Hart looked up calmly, meeting the Emperor's gaze. "Because it is alive. Because it suffers. Because understanding its pain teaches us something about the world, and about ourselves." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Humans survive because you are clever, not because you care. Empathy is irrelevant to strength. You will learn that here." Hart did not reply. Instead, he returned to the creature, adjusting the splint on its leg. He spoke softly, explaining each movement not to the creature but to himself, reminding himself why he was here. Humans had survived against impossible odds not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they noticed what others overlooked. Because they cared. And that care had saved lives countless times. Over the next days, Hart continued his work. He fed, cleaned, and observed the animals. He took careful notes, recording their behavior, their reactions to care, their subtle forms of communication. Slowly, the creatures began to respond to him. A small winged animal that had refused to eat now accepted food from his hand. A larger predator, which had growled whenever anyone approached, allowed him to examine a wound without striking. The Emperor came to observe again, accompanied by his attendants. Hart could feel the weight of their stares, the silent questions in their eyes. The Emperor leaned forward, intrigued despite himself as Hart explained each creature's needs, their fears, and their behaviors. He demonstrated how understanding these traits could prevent illness, increase survival, and even make the animals more effective for the Emperor's own purposes. "You claim this is practical," the Emperor said, voice low. "Yet it requires patience, time, and emotion. These are weaknesses. They slow action." Hart shook his head. "No. They make us stronger. Understanding, noticing, caring, they are tools. Humans survive not because we are the fastest or the strongest, but because we notice what others ignore. We connect, and connection creates power." For the first time, the Emperor paused, his golden eyes narrowing in thought. Hart noticed the subtle change, a flicker of curiosity, almost respect. He could see the gears turning in a mind that had never considered that empathy might be a form of intelligence. One evening, Hart was tending to the large wounded creature again when it made a small gesture, a gentle nuzzle against his shoulder. It was a tiny act, but in that moment Hart felt a spark of understanding between them. The creature was not just surviving, it was beginning to trust. And in that trust, Hart knew, lay the first lesson the Emperor might never forget. Karvok watched from above, silent, but something had shifted. The human's calm courage, his patient care, and the way creatures responded to him were not things the Emperor had expected. Hart had done something few humans could have. He had made the Emperor notice and perhaps, for the first time, feel. Hart straightened and looked around the hall. There were dozens of creatures here, each with a story, each with a need. And he realized, with quiet satisfaction, that this was only the beginning. Teaching the Emperor the value of empathy would take time. But if he succeeded, it could change more than just the lives of these creatures. It could change the way the entire empire thought about power, life, and care. He knelt again beside the wounded predator, speaking softly, his hand resting lightly on its warm, scaled side. The creature leaned into him, eyes closing briefly in trust. And Hart smiled, knowing that sometimes the smallest gestures could teach the greatest lessons. Days passed, and Dr. Hart continued to care for the creatures of the Emperor's menagerie. Each day brought small victories. The wounded predator moved more confidently, the winged creatures sang softly in the corners, and even the Emperor seemed to notice, though he did not say so aloud. Hart could feel the silent judgment in Karvok's eyes every time he entered the hall, a reminder that one mistake could end everything. Then one morning the Emperor arrived with an air of command that made the walls hum. Hart had been tending to the creatures when the Emperor's deep voice echoed. "Human, your work has drawn attention," he said. "You believe care is important. You believe empathy is a strength. Let us see if it is. You will prove your methods, or they will fail." Hart's stomach tightened. He had expected scrutiny, but the Emperor's tone carried a challenge. The Emperor's attendants brought forward a creature Hart had not seen before. It was massive, its scales dark with streaks of crimson, eyes glowing with intelligence and rage. Its tail lashed and its claws scraped the metal floor. The attendants said nothing. The creature was to be tested, and Hart understood instantly. The Emperor wanted him to show that empathy could overcome fear, danger, and aggression. Hart knelt slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. "Easy," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you." The creature hissed, a sound like grinding stone, and lunged. Hart sidestepped, using his knowledge of movement and body language to avoid being struck. He noticed the creature's muscles were tense, its mind sharp, its fear mixed with anger. It was not trying to kill out of instinct. It was testing him, challenging his presence. Hart realized that in its aggression, there was an opportunity. He spoke softly, telling it stories of other worlds, of humans who had survived impossible dangers, of creatures who had learned to trust again after injury. Slowly, cautiously, the creature's strikes became less aggressive. It circled him, eyes watching, until Hart could see a subtle shift. It was listening. Hart reached out a hand, not to grab, not to strike, but to show calm and patience. The Emperor leaned forward from his throne, silent. Hart could feel the weight of his gaze, sharp as a blade. If he failed here, the creatures and he himself would suffer. Yet Hart remained steady. He had learned that creatures, even alien ones, could sense honesty, care, and courage. After what felt like hours, the creature stopped circling and lowered its head slightly. Hart touched its scales gently, feeling warmth and tension beneath his fingers. He spoke softly, murmuring encouragement, and the creature relaxed further. It was still cautious, still wary, but it had begun to trust. Hart smiled quietly. This was not submission. It was understanding, the first step toward connection. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Interesting," he said finally. "You claim to have achieved control without force. Yet what proof do I have that this will last? That your creatures will obey when needed? That your empathy has any real power?" Hart thought for a moment. He realized the Emperor needed more than just observation. He needed a demonstration of results, of strategy that combined care and action. Hart devised a test. He would guide the creature through a challenge that mimicked the dangers of the Emperor's world. He led the massive predator to a training area, a series of platforms and obstacles designed for the strongest Zarok warriors. The creature hesitated, glancing at Hart. He spoke gently, reassuring it, showing that he understood its fears. Slowly, the creature began to move, stepping carefully, trusting Hart's guidance rather than relying on instinct alone. The attendants and the Emperor watched silently. Every movement was a statement. Hart knew that empathy here was not weakness. It was a tool, a way to communicate, to influence without cruelty. The creature completed the course, not perfectly but successfully, relying on trust and understanding rather than fear. The Emperor's golden eyes were fixed on them. "You are unusual, human," he said finally. "Most would break the creature, force it, or ignore it. You have used patience, understanding, empathy. And it worked. Explain this." Hart smiled, standing beside the massive predator. "Because creatures, even powerful ones, respond to care and trust. They understand fear, yes, but they also understand connection. Strength is not just power, it is knowing how to inspire loyalty, respect, and cooperation." The Emperor remained silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working. Hart realized that he had done more than care for the creatures. He had begun to teach the Emperor something about leadership, about power, about what humans called empathy. It was small, a single lesson, but it was a start. That night, as Hart returned to his quarters, he felt both exhaustion and hope. The creatures had responded, and the Emperor had noticed. But he also knew the Emperor would continue to test him, to challenge everything he believed in. Hart had survived dangerous worlds before, but this was different. Here, failure could mean more than death. It could mean the end of trust, the end of the chance to change a mind hardened by conquest. He looked back at the menagerie, at the creatures resting safely in their enclosures, some even approaching him now for food or gentle touch. Hart knelt among them, speaking softly. "We've made a start," he whispered. "One small step at a time." And somewhere above, on his throne, Emperor Karvok's eyes glowed faintly, watching, thinking. Hart did not yet know if the Emperor could truly understand what he had seen, but he knew one thing. The first lesson had been delivered, and the seeds of change had been planted. The challenge was not over. It had only begun. A week later, a crisis struck the Zarek Empire. A massive storm unlike any before swept across the capital, tearing through streets and corridors, flooding tunnels, and threatening the Emperor's menagerie. Creatures of all sizes panicked, cages rattled, and the attendants rushed in panic. Emperor Karvok's usual calm control faltered as he realized even his power could not stop nature itself. Dr. Hart had been sleeping in his small quarters when the alarms sounded. He ran toward the menagerie, heart pounding. The creatures needed help, and in this chaos, care and understanding could mean the difference between life and death. He burst into the hall to find cages overturned, water rushing across the floors, and terrified animals trying to escape. The attendants were shouting orders, but fear had made them ineffective. "Human, what can you do?" one attendant cried. "The storm cannot be controlled." Hart didn't answer. He moved quickly, guiding the largest predators to safer spaces, lifting cages that had fallen, calming smaller creatures with soft words and gestures. He knew that panic spread faster than the storm itself, and his calm presence was more powerful than the Emperor's commands. From his throne, Karvok watched. The Emperor had expected Hart to fail, to show that humans' so-called empathy was nothing in the face of danger. But Hart moved with precision, confidence, and care. Every animal he touched responded, every frightened creature he reassured became manageable. Even the massive predator that had tested him before obeyed his gentle guidance, not because of force, but because it trusted him. Hart spotted a wounded creature trapped under debris. Its breathing was shallow and it struggled weakly. Without hesitation, Hart lifted the heavy debris, speaking softly to calm it. The creature's golden eyes met his, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to fade. Hart could feel its fear, its pain, but also its trust. He wrapped it carefully in a blanket of protective cloth and carried it to a safe corner. The Emperor's gaze sharpened. This human moves with creatures as if he speaks their language. Yet he is no Zarek. He should be powerless. And yet, he leaned forward, the glowing light of his eyes reflecting both curiosity and something else, something Hart had not expected, admiration. The storm grew stronger, tearing through the city walls. Hart coordinated the attendants, showing them which creatures needed help first, how to use calm gestures to prevent panic, and how to work with the animals instead of against them. Slowly, methodically, the chaos began to subside. Creatures were safe, cages stabilized, and the hall was no longer a scene of terror. The Emperor rose from his throne, moving closer to Hart. For the first time, Karvok spoke without authority or accusation, only observation. "You have done what I thought impossible. You saved what I considered expendable. You acted not with power, not with fear, but with care. Explain this." Hart wiped sweat from his brow, breathing heavily. "It's simple. Every creature, no matter how strong or weak, responds to understanding. Trust is stronger than fear, guidance is stronger than force. Even the strongest leaders make mistakes when they rely only on power. Empathy shows you the truth that brute force cannot." The Emperor's golden eyes studied him, thoughtful. The storm raged outside, yet inside the hall, a quiet understanding began to take shape. Karvok realized that he had always led by control, by intimidation, by fear. That had worked in war and conquest, but it had never created loyalty, trust, or true understanding. And now, in the chaos of the storm, he had seen the power of something he had dismissed his entire life: care. Hart gestured to the creatures. "Look at them. They survived not because I commanded them, but because I understood them, because I noticed their fears and needs, and because I acted with patience. That is how true strength works. It is not in domination but in connection. For a long moment, Karvok said nothing. Then he approached the wounded predator that Hart had rescued, crouching slightly, watching how it nuzzled Hart's hand in trust. The Emperor extended a cautious hand, and the creature paused, then sniffed, then leaned slightly into the gesture. Hart held his breath. The Emperor was learning. Slowly, the alien's mind began to grasp what Hart had been teaching from the beginning. Empathy was not weakness. It was a form of strength unlike any the Emperor had ever known. By the time the storm passed, the creatures were calm, the hall was safe, and Hart's calm leadership had impressed everyone, even the Emperor's attendants. Karvok remained silent for a moment, watching Hart interact with the creatures. Then he spoke, voice low but steady. You have shown me something I thought impossible. That strength can come from care, from understanding, from connection. Humans are remarkable. Perhaps more remarkable than I imagined. Hart smiled quietly. It is what we have always known, he said. Strength is more than power. Understanding, empathy, and trust can change worlds, even entire civilizations. And it begins with the smallest actions, the smallest gestures. The Emperor studied him for a long time, then nodded. For the first time, Karvok allowed himself to consider that the galaxy did not move only by fear and conquest. Hart had planted a seed, and now the Emperor could feel it grow. He had witnessed what humans could do, not with weapons or war but with care, patience, and connection. That night, as the city slowly recovered and the creatures rested safely, Hart realized the first true breakthrough had been made. The Emperor's mind had opened just a little to a new way of seeing the world. And for the first time, Hart allowed himself a quiet hope. If he could continue, if he could keep teaching, the empire itself might change. Not through conquest but through understanding. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained. And in the quiet of the menagerie, the creatures and the human looked up. And even the Emperor seemed to understand that a single act of care could echo far beyond a single life. The storm had passed, leaving the city and the menagerie battered but alive. Dr. Hart walked slowly among the creatures, checking each one carefully, making sure they were safe and comfortable. The injured predator moved freely now, its leg healed and strong, and smaller creatures chirped and fluttered as he passed. For the first time, Hart felt the full weight of what had happened. He had faced the Emperor's challenge, and more than that, he had shown the power of empathy in a world that had never valued it. Emperor Karvok entered the hall quietly. The human had expected him to speak in commands or reprimands, but instead, the Emperor observed, silently. His golden eyes were thoughtful, less cold than before. Hart had seen a change in him over the past days, but this was different. Now, Karvok's posture carried something new, respect, perhaps even understanding. You have done what no one else could, the Emperor said, voice low but steady. You saved creatures I considered trivial. And you did it without fear, without weapons, without coercion. Only with patience and care. Explain how this is strength. Hart smiled faintly. Strength is not just what can destroy or conquer, he said. It is what can protect, understand, and inspire. You saw it during the storm. The creatures trusted me not because they feared me but because I noticed them, understood them, and acted for them. That is true power. The Emperor moved closer to the wounded predator, which now stood tall, muscles relaxed, scales shining. He extended a hand carefully. The creature hesitated, sniffed, and then leaned slightly into the Emperor's gesture. Hart watched silently. This simple act, trust given freely without fear or threat, was a breakthrough. The Emperor's mind, hardened by conquest and authority, was beginning to grasp a new truth. Empathy could be more powerful than fear. You speak as if humans are wiser than we are, Karvok said. Yet, you are small, fragile, and inexperienced compared to my warriors. How can such beings teach me? Hart stepped closer. It is not size, strength, or weapons that make humans remarkable. It is what we notice, how we connect, how we care. That is what allows us to survive, to adapt, to change worlds. Empathy is not weakness. It is a tool, a kind of intelligence, a way to make others stronger without taking anything from yourself. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though a thought had finally rooted in his mind. Hart could feel the shift. The Emperor would never forget this lesson, for it had been tested in fire and water, in chaos and fear. He had seen it in action, and now he had experienced it himself. Over the following days, the Emperor began making small changes. He ordered the attendants to improve the living conditions of all creatures, providing space, nourishment, and attention. He listened carefully when Hart explained the behavior and needs of each species. For the first time, Karvok asked questions not about strength or efficiency, but about comfort, trust, and understanding. The human zoologist had planted a seed, and the emperor nurtured it. News of the emperor's change spread slowly through the empire. Soldiers, diplomats, and scholars noticed the difference. The emperor's commands became less about fear and control, more about guidance and insight. Creatures in the menagerie thrived, and the emperor himself began to understand the importance of care, patience, and connection. Hart continued his work, guiding the creatures, observing, and recording. But now he also guided the emperor, teaching him lessons that no manual or training could provide. Together they created a small community of trust, where creatures and humans coexisted with respect, and where understanding became more valuable than domination. One evening, Hart stood beside the emperor in the menagerie, watching the creatures play and interact. The massive predator nudged the emperor gently, as if thanking him for finally noticing. The emperor looked down at Hart, a faint smile on his face, the first Hart had ever seen. "You have changed more than the creatures," Karvok said quietly. "You have changed me." Hart nodded, feeling a warmth he had never expected to feel from an alien ruler. "Empathy can change worlds," he said. "Not through force but through understanding. You've seen it, felt it, and now you can carry it forward." The emperor remained silent for a moment, then stepped back, surveying the hall. The creatures moved freely, no longer caged in fear. Hart realized that the menagerie was now a symbol of something greater, a lesson for the entire empire. A lesson that strength without care could falter, but care, patience, and connection could inspire loyalty, courage, and respect in ways brute force never could. For the first time, Hart understood the full scope of his journey. He had not only saved creatures and proven the value of empathy, he had shown that a single human could teach an emperor to see the world differently. And in doing so he had changed the galaxy, one mind, one heart, one life at a time. As night fell, the creatures settled, the emperor stood beside him quietly, and the stars shone through the green sky. Hart smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. The Zarek Empire would never be the same, and humans, small, fragile, and clever, had shown the true power of understanding and care. For the first time the emperor truly saw them, not as weak, not as fragile, but as remarkable. And in that recognition, the human zoologist had achieved what no weapon, no conquest, and no army ever could. He had taught the galaxy a lesson in empathy.